Hi, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Center for Fiction for welcoming Razom and Ukrainian Cultural Festival. Our collaboration actually started in 2022, in January 2022, when I sent a very desperate email to the Center for Fiction saying that they need to showcase a few Ukrainian novels that came out and that nobody heard about. And of course, that was right before the invasion and Ukraine was in the news. And I received an answer immediately, let's do it. So then invasion happened, but in April 2022, we were able to feature 4 Ukrainian novels here, and hopefully some of you were at this event. So Center for Fiction holds, very dear space in our hearts at Razom, because they were the first ones that said yes to collaborating with us. But now, more than 3 years later, there is still the urgency to share Ukrainian stories with American readers, because the war still goes on. And we're doing it through this Ukrainian Cultural Festival that there's a whole program in the back for you to check out. This is day 22 of the festival. We started on October 1st, and we're going to go on until October 30th. There are still a lot of interesting events and movies left, so please come to other events to see other authors and hear other Ukrainian stories. But what are Ukrainian stories? Are they only stories told by Ukrainians? Can a Ukrainian writer write about anything other than the war right now? Can an American writer explain Ukraine while also draw on their American experience? Do you need to have a distance from the war to actually write about it? I'm hoping that this event is going to speak to some of these questions, because I'm very curious to hear the answers. But allow me to then introduce our presenters today. Oksana Lutsyshyna is the laureate of Taras Shevchenko National Award in Fiction for her novel Ivan and Phoebe. Her earlier novel Love Life, which she's presenting today in English translation by Nina Murray, who coincidentally works for Razom. It just happened, she recently started. That novel follows a Ukrainian immigrant seeking belonging and meaning in the United States. While Sam Wachman's debut novel, The Sunflower Boys, centers on a queer Ukrainian teenager navigating the psychological aftermath of the invasion. Writing from opposite sides of the Atlantic about overlapping worlds, both authors probe what is lost and what can be found in translation, both literal and emotional. And moderating today's discussion is another great author with an experience of writing about Ukraine, Johannes Lichtman. Johannes was chosen as 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation, and his second novel, Calling Ukraine, which was about his experience of living in Lutsk, was named one of the best fiction books of the year by Library Journal. Please welcome Johannes, Oksana, and Sam.
Let's see. Can everyone hear us okay? Well, good evening, dobry večer. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you to Maria and Razom for organizing this wonderful event. And it's wonderful to be on stage with Sam and Oksana. Before we get into our discussion, I think maybe we'll just do a quick reading from both books. So Oksana, do you want to start with a little bit from Love Life?
Of course, thank you so much. The man Yora could not stop looking at was dressed with no apparent care. He wore a grey t-shirt with a burn hole on the chest and faded Hindi lettering across the shoulders, a basic pair of shorts, a bracelet made of fruit stones on his thin wrist, but his face glowed like the face of a saint on an icon. His entire head glowed, especially when he leaned over the water, studying a particular bird, or peering into the thickets on the far side of the river, and fell into the sunlight that came down in a neat cone. You could think it was the halo of his hair that burned in a tremulous contour, a myriad tiny darts of heat. When he finally turned so that Yura could take a better look at him, she was struck by the clarity of his face. His features were beautiful, but the individual features didn't matter. Something more important was hidden behind them. It felt like this man knew something that others did not. The day was quite hot, although the sun did not beat down as hard as it had at the height of the summer. In these latitudes, the bright greenery only thinned and yellowed a bit in winter, during the few rainless months, and now in September it stood as a solid wall, impenetrable to the sun of the still oppressive air. The river was a clean marble, uncommon among the tropical waterways, which were frequently muddy. Birds loved this place. A small white heron ambled along the bank. Yora was about to follow it to see it find some food and to let the serenity of the observation distract her, when she heard a quiet voice address her. The man she had been watching, slim as a youth despite his age, stood at the top of the wet steps. "Don't follow her," he said without a smile. "You'll frighten her." The smell of silt went to Yora's head. She looked up at the man and said nothing. He was tall, with the body of a former dancer, not ostensibly muscular like that of a regular gym goer, but well proportioned and full of quiet grace that cannot be obtained in mere weeks or even months. "Come here," he repeated. "Don't disturb her." Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Sam, do you want to read it a little bit?
Sure thing. Am I mic'd properly?
Can you guys hear Sam?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, fantastic.
Looks like you're good.
All right. Tato's package arrived yesterday. My birthday was 2 weeks ago, but it doesn't matter. A banged-up cardboard box covered in American stamps always arrives at the post office a few weeks after my birthday, my little brother Yuri's birthday, and St. Nikolai. Yuri turned 8 in April. Tato sent him a stuffed crocodile. The crocodile has big pointy teeth, so Yuri named it Arkady Petrenko, after our dentist. Arkady came with a postcard from Florida, where real crocodiles live, crocodiles without beady eyes and olive green fuzz, and tags that read, "Wash with like colors." I wonder if Arkady will be cold when winter comes here in Ukraine. For my birthday, Tato sent art supplies. He sent colored and graphite pencils, pastels, Conte sticks. They all came in their own wooden box with a latch that makes it look like something a pirate might bury on a desert island. He sent tortillons for blending and smudging lines and sticks of charcoal made from the world's blackest black. Best of all, he sent a sketchbook. It's leather-bound with a strap and a buckle and 100 thick, decal-edged pages. It's heavy and feels ancient in my hands, like some sacred relic unearthed from the ruins of an ancient city. The cover is decorated with the silhouettes of skyscrapers, the skyline of the city where Tato lives. He inscribed the inside cover in his messy handwriting. "Now you can draw here instead of your math homework. Don't forget, I love you." Nothing I can draw could possibly match the sketchbook's grandeur, but I can't just leave the pages blank either. So I decide to draw only the most important things in the sketchbook, 100 important things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So in a lot of ways, these are two very different novels. Oksana, yours is written in Ukrainian originally. Sam's, yours was in English. Yours takes place mainly in Ukraine. Yours takes place mainly in Florida. Yours came out originally before the full-scale invasion. Yours came out after. But there are some things in common. And one of the big things is that love or romantic love is like a major part of the story. So I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about how you see love, or how you thought about love as a part of this novel.
You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Well, it's such a human thing, love, and it's also a testing stone for each of us. It's nowhere we reveal ourselves as fully as during an intimate relationship. Also, in my particular book, it's a very important theme because the person who is, living through this is an immigrant. For an immigrant, love has perhaps a slightly different meaning than for a person who's living in their home country. Because when you're an immigrant, you're alone. You know a certain type of loneliness that you don't know when you're surrounded by the stuff you grew up around, or people or customs And in this loneliness, love becomes a substitute for family. This becomes very important because this person is more than just a romantic interest. This person becomes something more significant. So the loss of love is also, could be as something much more painful than if you still have your country surround you and be your holding environment, so to say.
As Johannes said, I think that our novels are kind of opposites of each other in some ways, but I do think that one thing that they share is that love is a source of anguish and a source of isolation in some ways. In my book, Artem is in love with his best friend, who is also a boy, Viktor, and he is similarly isolated, even though he is within his home country. He's not an immigrant yet, and I think that is also sort of a contributor to this general sense of isolation he feels, almost like a foreigner within his home country, because this is set in a place and in a time and in a milieu where homophobia is still very common, and so I do think that although your novel is set in Florida and the contributor to the isolation is that your main character is Ukrainian, you didn't actually say that it was set in Florida at any point in the novel, but you got very close to saying it, so I'm saying it for you.
I think Johannes said it.
Did Johannes say it?
Oh, wait. I just guessed. I thought it was Tampa. I don't know.
And my characters don't get to Florida until the last chapter.
Yeah.
I think that there is still a sort of a sense of spiritual Florida present throughout the novel, that isolation.
Yes, I appreciated the crocodile in your novel that actually overcame quite a lot with the characters.
The crocodile made it all the way through.
Well, we've already covered the Ukraine to Florida pipeline, which was going to be a lot of my follow-ups. But maybe I'll ask you about, you know, Sam, you alluded to this, sort of like neither of you are writing about love as like this simple, easy thing. This is difficult love, and in your case, you're writing about very unequal power dynamics in romantic relationships, and as you mentioned, you know, coming of age with a fear of homophobia around. So how did you deal with writing about these topics or presenting these topics, not only with one audience in mind, which is hard enough, but thinking about both an American and a Ukrainian audience?
Well, in a way, it's a very universal theme in most humans' lives. I wouldn't go as far as to say in everyone's life, but let's just say most. And it, just like as Sam pointed out, it's often we do have a situation where that is a source of isolation. How many times we were all brokenhearted and you have to go somewhere and see people and pretend you're okay. I think that's something that any audience can relate to. Even, you know, during times of catastrophes, surprisingly, what can be the most painful thing is a relationship that has broken in the middle of it all. People have, you know, even if they find themselves to be suddenly refugees, they still, the biggest pain that they feel at the moment, and I'm not saying that it's the deepest or the most important pain, there's no way to calibrate pain like that. But the pain that's the most immediate would be the pain of a broken relationship or rejection or separation or isolation or something like that. So in this sense, I think it's something that could appeal to pretty much anyone, and that's sort of one of those moments where we can say that it transcends borders.
Yeah, I mean, I concur with a lot of that. I have to, I mean, as far as American and Ukrainian audiences go, this book hasn't been translated into Ukrainian yet. I'm not sure if there are plans to do that in the future. So I'm not sure if the Ukrainian audience extends beyond the Ukrainians in this room. But I think that my feeling of, I guess, responsibility and conflict was that I am more an American portraying Ukraine to an American audience. And in depicting this ambient homophobia, I was very conflicted about, am I showing Ukraine in an unfairly bad light? Because Ukraine has come very far in the past couple of years, I think especially, but also I've spent years teaching English to Ukrainian kids, some of whom have become Ukrainian teenagers and begun to discover their own sexual orientations, and I see that there's still quite a lot of friction there. And I tried to convey that faithfully in my novel. But as far as depicting, your original question, I think, was about depicting love to two different kinds of audiences, and I think that Oksana's right, that's something that does transcend borders. I don't think it's simple for anyone in any culture. I think that everyone across borders has experienced love as a form of anguish.
I think that makes sense. So this is just switching gears a little bit, but I guess I want to ask each of you how you feel like the full-scale Russian invasion has changed not only how you write about Ukrainian characters, but also how you look at Ukrainian literature, or how, especially for Oksana, like with your background in Ukrainian literature, how, if at all, you feel like this has changed how Ukrainians read their own literature or the Ukrainian canon.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Ukrainians have discovered a lot about their own canon, because for a while they were looking at it through the prism of colonialism. It sounds surprising, but when you are the colonized, you kind of look at yourself with the eyes of the colonizer. You don't see things for what they are, but you develop a certain, a persona that kind of does it for you. So very much like Frantz Fanon said in Black Skin, White Masks. So in this sense, it's a great time to discover Ukrainian literature, because again, we will be, the whole world will be discovering it as Ukraine itself discovers it and rereads their own authors, and actually sees that it's a very rich literature, and it is totally deserving to be known in the world more than it is now. And I think this is the time when Ukrainians really come into their own, not just literature, but any culture. So for example, even though the cities are bombed, we have tickets to the performances, the plays sold out in the theaters. People come to the movies, people go to literary readings, people welcome authors, people write poetry as graffiti on the walls. So this is really showing that hunger for the authentic culture.
So I started writing this book before the full-scale invasion, and my interest in Ukrainian literature also started before the full-scale invasion, but I hadn't published anything until well into it. And I was writing a very different book at first, clearly, but also I was writing Ukraine in a very different way at first, because it was not in the spotlight nearly as much in the Anglophone media. And so I felt a little bit like I have this place that's important to me, that's mostly foreign to me, with some sense of roots, and I want to convey it to my homeland and in my language in a certain way. And the way that I wanted to convey it both changed, and also I was galvanized to convey it even more, I suppose, faithfully and with a certain direction once the full-scale invasion began, because I saw how Ukraine appeared in some people's consciousnesses for the first time when Russia invaded it, which is a terrible way for any country to come into being in a national consciousness. And I felt rather that was unfair. I knew one country, one place, and also there was this narrative that the invasion had gone from 0 to 100, that there was nothing before, there was no tension before, and then suddenly there was this war that came ex nihilo. And in fact, it's centuries of oppression and colonialism, and then there was Holodomor, and then all the Soviet oppression, and then there was the invasion of the Donbass in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and suddenly, only now has Ukraine appeared as something that Westerners are paying attention to. I say Westerners loosely, but Europeans, Americans, Canadians are paying attention to. And so, and the narrative was very much that that it was a categorical war zone, that this is all that it's been because it came into being as a war zone, and that's all that's ever going to be. And I wanted to show the version of Ukraine that I knew before the full-scale invasion, and that's why I decided to split the book down the middle. As far as interest in Ukrainian literature, I think that that's been oddly gratifying because more people are interested in Ukrainian literature now than before. And I remember maybe a week or two into the invasion, NPR published a list of like the most essential Ukrainian literature, and I was like, that's not it, they missed. And then a while ago, I got to publish my own list, which was much, I mean, I think it was better.
Just sticking it to NPR.
Absolutely. But I think that, but over time, there are more people who are aware not just of Ukrainian literature, but of Ukrainian music and culture in general, and symbolism and history, not always in an accurate way, but there's at least more of an awareness and more of an interest in understanding, you know, what is this country that is in the media so much? What is this country that is fending off an attacker that has also been the enemy of the US for a very long time?
And I wanted to follow up on that real quick, because you mentioned how you split the book down the middle of like half of its pre-invasion and half of its invasion and post-invasion. You know, there could easily be a version of this book where there's 30 or 40 pages that's pre-invasion and the rest is different. It's a very intentional choice. Why did you feel like it was important to really dig into a different pace and a different time and a different set of conflicts than a reader who, you know, sees Ukraine and, as you mentioned, thinks a certain set of images might expect from it?
Yeah, a few reasons, and I'm working this out live, so we're I think the main reason was that I wanted it to reflect the experiences of the war that not that I had particularly, but that many of my friends and many of my students had, where they had long, complex lives that were not really affected necessarily by war. And then in February of 2022, this did just suddenly put everything else on pause. Or it shattered it entirely. I mean, what you mentioned earlier, the fact that love can be warped by war. I'm paraphrasing here, but I think that's something that I've seen is that a lot of my friends have gotten divorced since the war, either because it's been terrible for their psyches, or one of them has ended up in another country and one of them has had to stay at home, and it's just the marriage is disintegrated. I think that there's all of these ways that there were full, rich narratives that were present before the war, and I wanted to pay complete homage to, and then I wanted to show how the war completely disrupted that. And without showing if it was only 30 to 40 pages of the pre-war, this would be definitively a war novel, which I wouldn't say it is. At least that wasn't my intention. It was supposed to be an interrupted coming-of-age story. Or it was supposed to be a coming-of-age story, and then it was interrupted. I mean, I put it on hold once the war started. I didn't write it for a year, didn't touch it. Felt like it was sort of a little bit radioactive because I didn't feel like I was capable of writing about this kind of thing, and there was much more important stuff to do than writing felt frivolous at that moment anyway. And then when it came back to when the time came to examine what I had abandoned on Google Docs, I didn't want to throw out everything that I'd already written. It was still a good story, and I still wanted to tell it, but it also couldn't be finished.
Well, for the record, I think you made the right call.
Thanks.
That's what you were waiting for, was my vote of approval.
I was waiting for, your validation.
Oksana, just to follow up a little bit, so Sam started talking a little bit about Ukrainian history, the history of colonialism, but also just of Ukraine as a country and as a people. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Yura and how she fits into, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I read her as someone who kind of came of age during the hard 90s, the post-Soviet time. And if you could talk a little bit about how you see her fitting into or not fitting into the Ukrainian literature, like the feminist tradition of Ukrainian literature and sort of a post-field work in the Ukrainian sex world.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for this question. So this book was also written before war, and actually before even the invasion of 2014, because in Ukraine this was published in 2015, but it was submitted to the publisher before that. So it actually doesn't carry this experience, and which is present in Sam's book, and I think Sam does a great job with the exposition, with showing us these peaceful lives and how exactly they were interrupted by war. I really like that. So to return to my character, Yora, who's an immigrant and who's actually kind of a loser. So not because she's an immigrant, which is just a personal choice rather than anything else. So she doesn't have a stable job. She doesn't own property. So in a way, in America, she's kind of a lost soul because. And I say this with love because I'm American too, partly, but Americans love their stuff. And if you're a person with no stuff, like, that's frowned upon. So, I deliberately didn't want to make her this, feminist character, because I think that very often feminist writing can be stereotypical. There is a certain stereotype of a strong woman, whether she's a Ukrainian woman or American woman or any kind of woman, and she's supposed to just overcome difficulties and kind of be on top of things and live through some sort of transformation that is also stereotypical often. I'm not saying this is always the case. So I was trying to push against that. I was trying to see, okay, what is this person who has no ambition of winning, this idea of making everything in your life about some sort of victory. But in real life, that doesn't happen. And some of the victories that we have are not something you can show to the public. You don't go around bragging like, I woke up today and I had breakfast, right? Though they say it's actually good to put it on the sheet of paper and cross it out as something you did today, because that produces dopamine, I don't know. I wanted to see the person who is not winning. I wanted to see a person who is not fitting into this narrative of somebody super strong. And actually a lot of my Ukrainian readers were deeply disappointed. I've been told that this is probably autobiographical because I'm myself a loser, obviously, and I was told that I must be somehow deranged or insane or some other, like I was pathologized in some other way, I was told that I'm probably one of those neurotic women who run after men and throw myself at them or something.
Well, that's not even accurate. That's her roommate.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know. I'm hoping that maybe the audience here would be a little bit more sympathetic to my intention, let's just say. Yeah.
Well, the part of that autobiographical piece I was just thinking about, because Maria gave me such a nice introduction, and she mentioned that my novel was autobiographical, by which I think she meant that I also lived in Lutsk. Spoiler alert, the main character does kill somebody, so it's not 100% autobiographical. But
do you want to tell us something?
Yeah, so for tonight, no. No, but I imagine that there was a double weight on you in this one because you're writing as a woman in Ukraine or anywhere, and then also carrying the weight of what you should be doing writing as a woman. And I wonder, what went into the choice of making her love interest, Sebastian, kind of an unworthy love interest, which was clearly an intentional choice. Both right. Yora and her roommate have kind of unworthy love interests that wreck them pretty bad. So what went into that choice?
Well, I think that's another one of those stories that a lot of people can relate to. It's almost like a passage into adulthood. We all have to find that horrible person that's going to wreck our lives, and then we will emerge as something completely different than what we were before. So it's almost like, in ancient societies they had the rites of initiation, and I think in the societies of today, especially this more or less technologically advanced societies with a lot of ideology of constant victories and so on and so forth, this has become a kind of an initiation rite. This is something to be taken seriously, though I know the culture will laugh at us and it will tell us that we are pathological and so on and so forth, but this unworthy love interest is very important. Everybody should always have one in their life to look back at and to kind of see how we have grown.
Yeah, well, I agree completely. And I think it's very difficult to write something when you know your reader might take it as autobiographical and you see the reaction of your non-ideal reader in your head, but you're like, I have to do it anyway. I like that you did that.
Yeah, and that's we never know what's autobiographical. That's a common question, I know, and I think we can, each of us can say that some elements were autobiographical, but you can always create this as a persona and just infuse them with a little bit of yourself, like whatever the necessary dose, and it's actually fun to see how they develop on their own, which I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. So switching gears a little bit to talk about language and translation. By the way, I just want to say I watched a event you did that was great, and I think the person you did it with is in the front row.
Yes.
And I was very distracted because I was like, I recognize him. Where do I recognize him from? Is he an actor? Then while you were talking, I remembered it. And I think that was really important for the audience to know. So thinking about language and translation, I wanted to ask you, Sam, first, obviously you wrote this in English, but you are rendering Ukrainian dialogue into English. And I want to talk a little bit about, like, what was that process like for you? What was the thought process of, obviously you speak both languages, but you're rendering a different language in English?
Yeah, I thought a lot about how I wanted to do that. For some of the lines of dialogue, they appeared to me in Ukrainian first because they were verbatim what someone had said to me, or I'd kind of stolen them from something that I'd overheard from a Ukrainian friend or a student, and I was like, then it didn't really calc quite right into English. But I also left a lot of intact Ukrainian in there, which I talked about with my editor a lot. And also because the transliterating it there's multiple standards for transliterating Ukrainian, and some of them look a little bit odd and might make an American reader stumble. I think that for me that was part of the joy of writing this book, though, and I think it's something I'm going to miss if/when I write a next book that doesn't involve the Ukrainian language. I mean, what I fell in love with when I started studying Ukrainian literature, I fell in love with the language first, the sound of it. I had begun studying it with the kind of motivation that if my great-grandparents could come back to life, I would like to be able to hold a conversation with them. Now, actually, they didn't speak Ukrainian. It turns out they spoke Yiddish. And I could have gone to Williamsburg and had a conversation with them and learned there, but I decided not to. I decided to stick with Ukrainian. I still think it's I'm very biased. I think it's the most beautiful language, and that was part of what I wanted to include in this book. I'm not sure how much of it came across, but I hope that it did pique people's interest, and I hope that it made them want to learn more. There's this strange thing that happens in language education at the university level in I think most of the non-Slavic world, which is that the base Slavic language that you learn is Russian, and then you learn other Slavic languages from there. And so most people who learn Ukrainian are going to have interference from Russian and are going to end up speaking in a kind of like a surjik, like a Creole of the two. And I think that my hope is that this is going to reach some people who are going to want to learn more, even just how to say, like, thank you, hello, that kind of thing. And they don't speak Russian first. They just kind of go around that and they fall in love with Ukrainian first.
And Oksana, I wonder, could you talk a little bit about, obviously you've lived in the United States for a long time, you speak and write in English some, you speak English, you write in English some. Could you talk a little bit about to what extent you collaborate or are in conversation with your translator, Nina Murray on this book, or any other translator?
Nina is great, and she's done 2 of my books, and they're totally different, and for each of them she found the language to which I'm amazed at her work. So what I like about working with Nina is that she really picks something about the language that is not just the words, but also what we'd call the cadence. It's basically the absence of words, where you need the pause so that it sounds natural. And it's usually very smooth. Nina does a draft, she shows it to me, we talk about things if we have to, but there's never been an issue where she got me wrong or mistranslated something, so I'm just really blessed having her. And I've worked with some other translators also who did some translations of my poems. I write poetry also, and it also was a very happy collaboration. So I don't have any horror stories for the Halloween about translators. And the hardest thing that Nina has done is not in this book, but in my other books, a book Ivan and Phoebe, where she had to deal with Transcarpathian dialect. I come from the town of Uzhhorod, which is the very west of Ukraine. It's on the border with Slovakia and Hungary. It's called Transcarpathia, and it's kind of a cauldron. It's a mixture of different languages. There's a strong Hungarian population, Slovakian population, and some German population. So people speak the dialect that sounds like nothing anybody has ever heard, and people from other regions from Ukraine do not understand what people there say, and it's different in different villages. So Nina had to deal with that, and what Sam mentioned also, that the influence of Russian, it mixed with Ukrainian, and in some cases it created a Creole, so people speaking this sort of both of them at the same time. And sometimes they're speaking that and Transcarpathian dialect, and sometimes with some phrases purely Russian and some phrases purely Ukrainian. So, and that defines their social situation sometimes, like say it's a person from the village who's ambitious and came to town during the time of the Soviet Union, means that they spoke Russian as their adopted tongue more, and Ukrainian less. Or maybe it's an ambitious person from the village who came to the city during Ukrainian times, after 1991. So that means they speak more Ukrainian. And imagine now Nina trying to figure it all out and to put it all in English.
Well, poor Nina. I wonder, Oksana, I know you started, or you've been writing some essays in English. How do you feel like your voice changes when you're writing in English rather than Ukrainian?
I'm still trying to figure it out, and I seem really smart to myself when I write stuff on Facebook and my friends like it. I feel truly empowered, and so I tell myself I should write for a larger audience so that I feel even more empowered. And then I start, and then I realize, okay, that's not what I wanted to say at all. So it's a bit of a struggle. I think in English I do really well with abstract notions, but whenever it comes to imagery, I don't really do that well with that. You know, it's kind of like we write poems in our first language more. So yeah, it's a balance that I'm still trying to find.
So I wonder, Sam, you mentioned a little bit about language learning, but you are both, to varying extents, teachers, and you taught English in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. So I wonder, can you talk a little bit about how that experience of teaching English in Ukraine, how that influenced your thinking about the novel?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it kind of gave birth to the novel. I'm not a teacher, and I was not very good at it. And those kids do speak English now, but largely because of YouTube. Also, I have never taught anyone who has hit puberty. We're talking mostly single-digit ages. So it was a lot of very basic. I'm just trying to be an approachable American, not scary. Hello, how are you? My name is. But building the relationships with those kids and their families, and also some of my friends, it was their kids as well that I was working with, and becoming a part of that community in some odd way as the resident American. I think that was really what made me want to write about Ukraine, because I came back and I was in a creative writing course on Zoom during the bad times, and I thought I really do want to write about this place, and I was feeling nostalgic for it. It was a much better time, and it was a time when I felt at the same time very alien, because I'm in a part of Ukraine where not a lot of tourists go, rural Vinnytsia Oblast, and down by the Moldovan border. And so there's not a lot of Americans just wandering around, and for definitely a lot of the kids, I was the first native English speaker that they'd met. But also, I felt very much at home in an odd way, because that is where my great-grandparents came from, and that's where I have a lot of roots. And you see people wandering around, and a lot of them look like me in like a very strange way. And so I think that I was pining for that sense of connection when we were then all relegated to our bedrooms, and we were doing things on Zoom and trying to figure out how to not want to die. I had gone from one of the most connected times in my life to one of the most atomized times, and so that was part of what the most embryonic stage of this book, the most embryonic version, was born of that.
And Oksana, can you talk a little bit about how teaching American students about various aspects of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history, how that has influenced the way you think about writing, or your writing at all, if it has?
Well, it was a privilege, and I've had some excellent students. I've taught mostly literature, but some language too, and we actually read some Ukrainian literature, not in translation, with those students. I had some really passionate people who wanted to read stuff, and sometimes to the point where the supervisor who would come to observe my classes would be disturbed by the difficult topics that we are discussing. You know, we were reading our writers from the 1920s, and it's a particularly dark story by Mykola Khvylevy called Self-Romantica. It's about a matricide, basically, and the supervisor pulled me in. Does this person really want to read it? Are you sure you're not imposing this horror on these poor people? But I have to say that yes, they did want to read it. They got really into it. And it was a pleasure and an honor to interact with them. And actually kind of jumping to today, it's wonderful to have on the panel with me people who actually been to Ukraine, know Ukraine, studied Ukraine, like you guys, and we can actually converse from the same sort of platform here. So I think it's kind of what happens when you teach people about Ukrainian literature, you teach language, you sort of create friends, really. That's the best lesson that I think I took out of all of that.
So in a second here, we'll open it up to questions. I'm going to ask one more question of Sam and Oksana, but then I'll turn it over to you. So if you want to start thinking of some really smart, preferably deeply confrontational questions that you can ask the author, we'll do that in a second. But speaking of difficult topics, so last year, Forgottenness by Tanya Malyarchuk was published by Norton, and I believe that's the first novel translated from Ukrainian into English published by a major American trade publisher, which is in some sense kind of astonishing. Partly that's because of American trade publishing's aversion to publishing literature in translation, especially from cultures that American readers might not be super familiar with, but also it's partly because Stalin killed a whole generation of Ukrainian writers who might have written that novel. So thinking about that and the Ukrainian artists that we are sadly losing over the last, since February 24th, I wonder for each of you, how do you think about the question of survival in Ukrainian identity in your fiction, and escaping, as Oksana Zabushko says, the Ukrainian curse of non-existence, and writing for all the voices that were silenced? How do you think of that? Very big question, but in any part of that you want to tackle?
Well, Oksana Zabushko once said that every Ukrainian intellectual or writer or artist works at least for 4 people who were not born. Now, some anthropologists argued with her about that, but I think she has a point that it's not uncommon that a person who is writing novels would also be writing poetry or translating, and then at the same time perhaps teaching at the university or writing scholarly work. So I think that's actually changing, because now there's more stratification, and there's the community is much stronger now and bigger. So I do think that this will continue, this momentum will continue, at least I want to hope so. And it used to be that also the way the Soviet Union functioned, it only allowed certain people to come to the point of being published, because you had to correspond to these demands of Communist Party and so on and so forth. That sort of structured people in a particular way. There was a sense of inferiority complex, not just because you are Ukrainian and therefore you're worse than Russian by default, such was the ideology, but also because you as a person were oppressed by totalitarian state and told that you are nothing, that you have no right to have the voice. So the great example of the opposite would be the work of Victoria Amelina, a Ukrainian writer who was killed in 2023. She was a civilian, and she wrote a book in English looking at women, looking at war, where she was fluent in English because she lived in Canada for a while. She actually writes this non-fiction, really talking about her women friends and journalists and writers, and she, while doing so, she tells the audience, the Western audience, the English-speaking audience, about Ukrainian history, Ukrainian literature, and she does it so smoothly, and it doesn't have to be profoundly scholarly kind of work. She showed us all that we have to just address all audiences, just like she did with that book.
Speaking of Victoria Amelina, I think that there's also plans to translate her book, Dimka Doma. How do they, A Home for Dom?
I think they did Dom's Dream Kingdom. Dom's Dream Kingdom.
Okay,
right?
yeah. They went with that? Okay. It's a really excellent book, and I'm really grateful to whatever powers that are out there that are continuing to keep her spirit and her work being, reaching new readers. I think I kind of forgot the original question listening to you because your answer was so good. But I think that regarding the future of Ukrainian literature and the concept of disappearance and erasure and such, which I think is the direction that we were going in there, I'm very cautiously optimistic. I mean, I want to think that things are going to continue going in the right direction, like you said, Oksana. I think that now the difference is that there are more eyes on Ukraine. And I mean, there are a whole lot of people in this room who could have spent their evening not being here. I mean, I think it's raining outside, and yet they came and they wanted to hear about Ukrainian literature. And I think that's a really hopeful, good sign. I'm not even related to all of them. And so I think that I think this is the beginning of Ukrainian literature spreading. I don't think that this is just a flash in the pan. And that's maybe my wishful thinking.
Very good. All right. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Who has a question? It's always hard to ask the first one.
It's not the question, but I just wanted to provide a piece of information that Victoria Amelina's novel is getting translated, and Razum for Ukraine is providing a translation grant for that novel. So it is going to be coming out in United Kingdom, hopefully in 2027. And then I'm hoping that one of the publishers in the US will pick it up once it does well in UK.
Wonderful. Who else has a question?
Let it be me to break the ice, Oksana. My question to you is, and I don't know if Sam is also writing poetry, but my question to you is, how does your poetry interact with your prose? Do you sometimes feel like one influences the other, or are there some topics that keep recurring? Would be interesting to hear.
Thank you so much, Vasilina. It's an excellent question. I try to keep them separate. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but I've designated poetry as a zone of freedom, which means I never rush to finish anything. I don't keep deadlines. I don't try to get famous that way. It's just there. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, I just let it go.
Hello, thank you both so much. So my parents are both from Khmelnytsky originally. And I think growing up, I just had the a lot of confusion about what home and homeland were. And I'm just curious because both of you are writing fiction about, I guess, countries in which you didn't grow up, right? I guess this current novel is about a different place. So I'm wondering how the idea of home kind of sits with you as you write.
I think that for me, I think I had it easier actually because I was able to write about Ukraine from the perspective of someone who is not from Ukraine and who's not going to stay in Ukraine his whole life. I think that it would be much harder for Fish to write a book called Water. I think that, if I were to try to write about America and make it really like, the book in which I am trying to portray America, I would know too much. I would have too much I would be seeing too much of the innards. I had kind of the privilege of being more than a tourist, but certainly less than a Ukrainian. And so while I have affection, and while this was meant as at least in part as a love letter from diaspora to ancestral homeland, it was also, it also was a little bit easier. I got to portray more of a snow globe Ukraine than the full version. And I think that if I was coming from Oksana's perspective, I think I would have had a much harder job.
When I just moved to the United States, I lived in Florida for about 13 years. And I remember when I just got there and a friend of mine was saying, he was from there, that you will start feeling at home when you know the names of the plants and animals and birds. And I didn't believe him, and he was right, because at some point in my head, I know that Ukraine is my home and it's where my soul belongs, where all of me belongs, but yet at the same time, once I learned the names of Florida birds, it also became home. And it kind of shifted something in me, so again, this is not necessarily home in any deep existential meaning, but it's a spatial home. It's the space that you love as your own, and the nature that you love. So I think that can happen on that level. It doesn't have to be anything complex. It doesn't even have to include this element we call culture in an anthropological sense, meaning all the practices of life that we have. But it can also be deep love for this particular spot where you're standing right now sometimes.
Does anyone have another question? I think we have a little bit more time.
Maria?
Over mine.
Sam, I was kind of really touched by your novel, how traumatic it became for me, because once I got to, the scene in the middle, it is very difficult to read to Ukrainian. I kind of wonder if you've gotten any feedback from American readers, if they have the same reaction. And I think that's where the distance comes into, because I'm not sure that the Ukrainian writers are capable to write about this now. And that's hence the question to Oksana is do you feel you can write about the war, and when do you think you'll be able to write something that actually describes this experience?
I think that from American readers, I think that the reaction is that they've read a sad book and that they're very sad about it for a while, and some of them are even moved to DM me on Instagram about how sad they are and how it's my fault. But then they can put it away because it's not necessarily speaking to something so directly in their own lives. From Ukrainian readers, the handful of Ukrainian friends who worked with me throughout me writing this novel, and I was passing little paragraphs to them and then whole chapters and going, does this feel good? Does this ring true? Does this feel like I'm exploiting something? What should I change? I think that for some of them it was hard, and for some of them it was cathartic, and sometimes that was the same person. I think that essentially I kind of said I have a voice here. I have a book deal, and I'd like you to put your fingerprints on it a bit. And so I think that I hope that Ukrainian readers can also find some catharsis because I also have this remove. I'm able to say things and to show things without it totally wrecking me. And so I think that's been the major difference in the reaction between American and Ukrainian readers. The other difference, of course, is that for American readers, there's this story that I hear over and over where it's, well, I've seen this in the news, but I didn't know it was like that. And so if I can add some emotional or human dimension to whatever news they're receiving, then that's also something I'm really grateful for.
I really like that Sam brought up the concept of catharsis. We kind of forget about it lately when we are talking about literature or art, because it kind of oftentimes is not what is rewarded, so to say. Readers don't necessarily understand the value of it because they were never taught that they should, and so on and so forth. And entertainment becomes kind of the chief thing, or maybe informing people about something. But in reality, if we think about what was catharsis, it's kind of like having a good cry while watching a theater play. And that's why the theaters in ancient Greece were located near the temples of the god of medicine, because that was medicine. So I think, and if we think about it that way, and if we confront the question of writing about the war, we see that what is the point of literature? It's to produce this catharsis, but the society is so wounded, it cannot live that catharsis. It cannot necessarily come to that theater as much as we'd like them to. So, and there's a lot of debates right now in Ukrainian literature how people should write about the war, who should write about the war, whether I, an immigrant, should write about the war, whether I have the right to write about the war, whether people who are in the front lines are the only ones who know what the war is and are allowed to write about the war, so to say, or maybe the people who are, you know, outside of that theater of war, who are at home, who are in the cities that are not necessarily bombed, like my city, Uzhhorod, that's behind the Carpathians. Do they have the moral license to write about the war? So, and I think these debates will be ongoing for a while. So I don't think I will be able to write about the war as of now. But the other important truth is that Ukrainian society has been so wounded by a lot of things in the 20th century that we still have to come to terms with some of our older traumas and to process the experience of totalitarianism and experience that Johannes mentioned, how our best novelists and poets were killed by Stalin, for example, and the lack of that. The experience of Holodomor, the famine orchestrated by Stalin in 1932-33. There's not, surprisingly, there's not many Ukrainian novels about that experience. World War II, the Holocaust, the Poraimos, which is the Holocaust of the Roma people. So I think novelists still have a lot of work in Ukraine.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you to Sam, thank you to Oksana, and thank you all of you for joining us.